students who aren't manageable. Pacific University is named for a city that takes its name from Chief Seah, the chief of the Duwamish people whose territory and traditional land stretched across our campus. We respectfully acknowledge with gratitude that we are gathering today on that land, both ceded and unceded, for the Coast Nation people, land which has to share waters with all tribes and families in the Duwamish, Layla, and Nunchi nations. People who are still here with us today. We recognize that the faith of our actions is not enough. The community strives to love God and neighbor. We present the ways we participate in tomorrow. We make the reconciliation and repair with the Coast Nation people as we continue to learn and to care for the land. The annual Wheeler Faculty Award Lecture was established in 1975 to honor Dr. Winifred in the year of her retirement from Salem Pacific University after she had served 40 years as a SPU professor. The endowment to support the lecture was given by another SPU emeritus professor, Dr. Ross Shaw, and his wife Barbara. Ross served SPU as a biologist for 31 years. A wonderful colleague who was also the second director of Blakely Island Field Station. The Wheeler Lecture, it says in its statement, quote, provides a public platform from which the claims of the liberal arts in the Christian University are established. Each year, a faculty member is chosen by their peers to receive the award and present, quote, scholarship informed by Christian worldview, unquote. We're about Dr. Wheeler. Dr. Wheeler earned her doctorate in 1933 from the University of Chicago. I imagine that class was fairly small. And when she joined Salem Pacific, she was probably the only one with a doctorate at the time. There might have been a few others, I haven't looked at the record lately, who had an earned doctorate. She quickly set out to create her first course in classics, and then a whole program developed as the Department of Classical Language. Over the course of 40 years, her passion for languages and literature inspired countless students. I had the opportunity to know that Dr. Wheeler, you may know the name Eugene Peterson, taught Eugene Peterson Greek in the basement of Alexander Hall. Don't you dare even try to put the basement of Alexander Hall. She was interested in physical education, was SPU's first female coach, leading athletic programs for over a decade. An amazing woman. I got to see her, I think it was three of the Wheeler lectures. She was able to make it when we were here, and she'd get up and say a few words, and then she'd stop and look out and say, where are the women scholars? This was meant to be a lecture at the time. She wanted to inspire change. This lecture is a wonderful tribute to the importance of scholarship, teaching, and service in the vocation of the Christian University professor, many of whom are here tonight. And that legacy is something that lives amongst those here tonight. I invite you to join me in prayer as we open this evening, and then Dr. Katie Hannenberg will introduce tonight's speaker for us. Let us pray. God of our heads, our hearts, our hands, we are grateful for your gifts of knowledge and wisdom that we use to love you and our neighbor. We are grateful for our colleague and friend Paul and ask that you be present with us tonight as he illumines our minds and our hearts. Amen.
Good evening, everyone. It's great to see you all here, and I want to extend a special welcome to the family of our Wheater cross-cultural psychology, has led several study abroad trips to South Korea, was born in the Philippines, has just an extensive body of knowledge of cultural differences that he contributes to our department. He is the first chair of our skills diversity committee. He's recently expanded his scholarly portfolio to be more accessible to a wide variety of audiences, and is doing a podcast with several of our esteemed colleagues in this room, as well as doing blogs for Christian Scholars Review and Psychology Today. I've gotten to know him more personally through working on the Living Well Initiative, which is a really kind of amazing opportunity to explore intersections of physical health, mental health, and faith with students ranging from undergraduate to doctoral students. And with some of that, he's a powerfully kind and gracious man. I know a lot of us are looking at David versus to an implementation of his coming day after tomorrow on Thursday. And Dr. is truly an illuminator. He expands our knowledge in this very profound, gentle, wise way. And tonight, by sharing part of his cultural expertise as well as his deep love for us in our community, I know he'll expand our understanding as well. So please join me in welcoming this year's Leader Lecture recipient, Dr. Youngbin.
Dr. Steele for the introductions. Good evening, everyone. It's so good to see all of you. Thank you for spending your evening with me today. I know it's not early evening, at least in my books, it's late evening. So thank you for being here. While my full-time teaching role is at SPU, I have a side gig. And that side gig takes me to South Korea, where I teach at a couple of universities in Korea. So, my job is to evaluate which course materials are used in the classroom. And because of that, one of those materials that function lectures and classroom concepts purely generalize across cultures, including outside of my career. So today I'd like to feel that's correct. I'd like to push three Korean cultural constructs from the margins to the center, and those are Han, Nunchi, and Jeong. My hunch is that you might have heard of these constructs. David Brooks, again, who will be on our campus in a couple of days, talks about Nunchi, mentions Nunchi early in his book. Chances are, though, when you did encounter them, you kind of engage them from a safe psychological distance and not really thinking about how they might connect to your everyday living. So today, I hope that the lecture does more than just adding to your shelf of knowledge about Korean culture, but instead allows you to think about helpful lessons for both individual and communal flourishing. It would be helpful to name a few assumptions before we begin. And those assumptions are about psychology and other aspects of my talk today. So first, psychological science is a largely descriptive endeavor. It's primarily concerned with the way things are and less with the way things ought to be. We are storytellers in psychology. We use numbers and qualitative evidence to convey our story. So consistent with this emphasis in my field, today I will focus primarily on describing the three cultural constructs. At the same time, psychology can offer some clues as to how we might bring about human flourishing. That its descriptive components can also lead to a reimagining of what flourishing might look like interpersonally and communally. Second, like all human postures and actions, Han, Nunchi, and Jeong reflect the effects of sin. A critical engagement of these constructs must include a clear description of how they exhibit our fallenness, and the articulation of how these concepts can be redeemed for human flourishing. Third, I want to say that these constructs are, or the degree to which these constructs are emphasized in Korean culture is unique. However, the constructs are not unique to Koreans. Simply put, those of you who are non-Koreans, and I see many who are not, should still be able to relate to these constructs. And then fourth, as the Persian poet Rumi said, the cure for the pain is in the pain. Western psychological concepts or psychological emphasis separates or demarcates between etiology, as in cause of mental illness, features or symptoms, and treatment of mental illness. But today, I hope that the lines between those three aspects will become blurred and necessarily so, and challenge your assumptions about how you think about psychopathology. Okay, so let's start with Han. Han is widely understood as a collective anguish and anger in Korean people. Han also depicts persons or families' unresolved sadness following the experience of deeply traumatic events. So there are both collective, interpersonal, and intrapersonal aspects of Han. To grasp the interpersonal and intrapersonal aspects of Han, we must first start with the collective aspect. There are two well-known historical traumas and not too long ago tragedies in South Korea. First is the Japanese colonial period. One of the most horrific aspects of the colonial period is the painful story of the women who were forced into sexual slavery. In Korea today, they are referred to simply but respectfully as 할머니, which means grandmother. The fact that this was a Japanese government directed program only adds to the atrocities. One estimate is that up to 200,000 girls and women were taken into sexual slavery, and that often young girls were taken with a false promise of employment or financial benefit to the family. What you see here is a drawing by Kim Sun-duk 할머니 recalling the time that she was taken. As a collective, you can imagine that the relationship between Korea and Japan is complicated. Every political clash with Japan is interpreted against the backdrop of the colonial period. Every Korea-Japan sporting event is an opportunity for the whole country to demonstrate a zeal unmatched for any other sporting opponents. If you think U.S.-Canada sporting events are vicious, it's tame compared to what it might look like when you have Korea playing Japan. Korean athletes themselves experience an added level of responsibility whenever they face Japan in sports. To lose a game to Japan is letting the whole country down. You see here, this is the Korean baseball team seeking the forgiveness of their nation after they lost to Japan in the 2023 World Baseball Classic. An SPU student who participated in my South Korea Study Abroad program wrote the following.
I've never seen countries that the U.S. fought against as personally offensive or repulsive, and I falsely assumed other countries felt as indifferent as I did. I was very wrong. I learned and saw firsthand how personal war and its atrocities are to the Korean population.
Korea's Han is maintained today due to the ongoing political clashes with Japan. The face of these clashes is the refusal of the Japanese government to fully acknowledge that sexual slavery took place, and to issue a sincere apology regarding the extent of the harm inflicted on the 할머니es, despite continued pressure from global communities and global leaders, including the UN and South Korean leaders. I'll return to the 할머니es and Han in a bit. The second traumatic event was the Korean War. The reason that the Korean War and all its aftermath is traumatic is that the country was literally divided in half, paying a heavy price following the clash of the superpowers. Heartbreakingly, the Korean Peninsula is still at war. There was an armistice signed back in 1953, but there was never a completion of the complete resolution of the conflict. The pain of a nation at war with its sibling is felt throughout South Korea. Sometimes the pain is felt more acutely when skirmishes break out between the soldiers of the two sides. Other times, it's felt more subconsciously when Seoulites go about their day in their bustling metropolis, which also, by the way, is one of the safest cities in the world, with the repressed knowledge that Pyongyang, the North Korean capital, still at odds with South Korea, is a mere 197 kilometers away. For context, that's closer than Seattle to Vancouver, Canada. The Han associated with Japan's colonial period is best captured as resentment or anger. Han linked to Korea as a divided nation is one of profound sadness. In the West, the news that sells is the one that paints North Korea as the enemy, with its dictator Kim Jong-un as the unpredictable, mysterious, and mockable leader. In contrast, many South Koreans depict and understand North Koreans as their siblings. After my SPU students toured the demilitarized zone, DMZ, one student made this observation.
From our tour guides, Mr. A and U.S. soldier, Mr. B, I saw a stark contrast in how they spoke about the North and South Korean governments and people. Mr. A had obvious desires of reunification, going so far as to say Kim Jong-un is his brother. Mr. B referred to North Koreans as the enemy and shared his negative experiences with North Koreans. Mr. A displayed a deep sense of discontent about the division, conveying the Han or collective angst that Koreans experience. Mr. B seemed to only want to share about the division of the two countries.
The collective level naturally extends to the interpersonal levels of Han. Hyun-ok describes Han as an astonishingly terrible sequence of events that have taken place in the life of a person or family. In the Oscar-winning movie Parasite, you see a Korean family unit experiencing Han after doing everything they can to stay afloat under the weight of classism that's determined to sink them. After repeated setbacks, in one poignant scene, the protagonist says the following to his son: "Do you know the most foolproof plan? It's no plan. Because in life, if you plan anything, nothing will go according to plan." I'm trained as a counseling psychologist, so I feel obligated to bring you a clinical example from the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of the Mental Disorders. Hwabyung is recognized as a psychological disorder in the DSM, and it's something specific to the Korean culture. Hwa means anger, Jeong means illness. So literally, anger, illness. But it might as well be called hanbyung, as it's believed to be an externalization of internalized Han. As described in the DSM, the symptoms include somatic symptoms such as trouble breathing, as well as cognitive and emotional components like fear of impending death and deep sadness that does not lift. The question then becomes, is Han something to get rid of? I contend that Han, in all its pain and suffering and ugliness, can offer up some solution to the issue of internalized trauma or angst. As Heading Nam wrote, Han is sorrow and hope. First, Han can stir up creativity in those who experience it. The American existential psychologist Rollo May said that a healthy response to life's angst is to create something. That energy from life's deep questions can propel one into a meaningful endeavor, which he referred to as a creative project. The act of creating something in response to Han is akin to Sigmund Freud's notion of sublimation as a coping mechanism, which refers to the idea of channeling negative energy to something less negative or maybe even positive, like someone who takes up taekwondo as a way to channel their aggressive energy. In Korea, traditional and contemporary art, music and poetry have been an outlet for the angst of a nation. I'm glad that worked. There's music playing in the background, and that music is perhaps the most well-known Korean traditional song, Arirang. And as you see in the lyrics here, the lyrics are obscure. It talks about this idea of someone who is bidding their lover goodbye, but also kind of like really bitter for them and saying, I hope you don't go far, right? But beyond these obscure and poetic lyrics, the song Arirang has been used as a way to, for example, protest, and also as a way to think about the way in which North Korea is still our sibling. Back in 2018, in the Winter Olympics, the South and North Korean women's hockey team made history by competing as a unified team. They didn't do well in terms of their record. However, every time they came out, The song that they played was Arirang as a way to symbolize this unity between the two teams. You also see Han in modern Korean entertainment. You might have heard of Squid Game, which is, as far as the last time I checked, the most watched Netflix show ever. The dark and violent dystopian drama portrays the Han of those suffering at the hands of capitalism, those who are literally dying and killing because of the weight of capitalism but cannot let it go due to the illusion of wealth that could be theirs. Squid Game is an example of a creative outlet of Han that has garnered universal relatability. Second, Han can foster a sense of belonging and meaningful connection between people. Han, in all its agony, can bring together those with shared trauma and offer validation of painful experiences. This type of joining of clothes can include connecting across generations, statuses, and roles. Han is something that gets passed down from one generation to the next, as a reminder to the next generation to never forget, always remember. And we promise to return to the harmonies. To protest the Japanese government's refusal to issue a formal apology for their role in sexual slavery, Koreans gather to this day in front of the Japanese embassy in Seoul every Wednesday. The not-so-creative name for this protest is Wednesday Protest. And they demonstrate. The Wednesday protest began in 1992, so they have been taking place for over 30 years. The protest does not just involve the harmonies, but also young children, as depicted here in this photo. This intergenerational aspect, again depicted in this photo, is beautiful. While it's a painful picture because of the Han of the harmonies, it's simultaneously something that is bringing multiple generations together. How might Han go awry? Because of Han's inclination to be inward-facing, it can prevent a community from truly seeing the Han of others. Some Korean scholars have criticized the notion of Han, arguing that there is a misunderstanding that Han is something that only Koreans can experience. Indeed, if we operationalize Han as a collective trauma, one does not have to dig deep to come up with non-Korean examples. Whether it's the Holocaust, Pol Pot's totalitarian regime in Cambodia, the historical and contemporary injustices experienced by Black Americans in our own nation, the list goes on in terms of global communities that have experienced significant Han. As Min-Soo Kang writes, a historian at the University of Missouri St. Louis, the notion of a specific kind of sorrow, regret, frustration, rage that only Koreans can feel is absurd. But we can counteract the inward-facing nature of Han and redirect its energy to increase our compassion toward others who are also suffering. As Kuan Taekmender writes, the language of humanity is captured in the idea of Han, and it's always with me, according to Kuan Taekmender, tucked away like tiger bomb, drawn out only for special times, especially when solidarity is called for. Similarly, here is my friend and colleague, Dr. David Frizzard, professor who teaches at Hanyang University and Seoul Women's University, eloquently describing how Han can be something applicable to all of us in this room, to those who are in non-Korean settings.
Han comes when you are willing to listen to others, and in doing so, you then realize that the Han you understand and feel, to some extent, is different from other people's Han. It is personal, yet at the same time collective, and each instance is a different dialect of the same universal feeling. I think in many ways this is how Han can be beneficial to us all beyond a specifically Korean or academic setting. We can learn that other people's trauma can and should be understood by others, why we will never experience what they experience directly, by having the courage to listen, by taking the time to read and embracing the power of great art. We can develop ourselves as humans. We don't naturally assume that the methods of life and experience of consciousness is the same for us all. But instead, our variety of ways of being provides the real beauty of life. For Han is meant to encapsulate a sense of beauty. Eastern philosophical systems talk of things dual arising. You can see it in the symbol of the yin-yang. You can also see it on the front of the South Korean flag. Without night, there is not day. Without good, there is not evil, and without heaven, there is not earth. Han, when understood at a certain level, gives us both sadness and beauty. It gives us loss and life. It is grief and it is art. Han is, at the fundamental level, something very, very human. And in that sense, Han is something for us all.
Han is something for us all. I'm especially hopeful about how Han can foster Korean American solidarity with experiences of Black Americans. Han can act as a corrective experience to the experience of the model minority stereotype, which is a widespread generalization that Asian Americans, when compared against other communities of color, are more successful, are more hardworking, and so on. It especially compares or pits Asian Americans against Black Americans. If the model minority stereotype is obsessed with pitting Korean American experiences against Black American ones and declaring their respective experiences as miles apart, Han offers a radical counter that the Korean and Black experiences can overlap. I became aware of a rap song. Trust me, this is not my go-to genre, but I was reading an article by Dr. Sandra Choi Kim, and she does an in-depth analysis of this song titled Hood, and it's by Korean artist Pablo and American artist Joey Badass. And students, I did say badass in a public lecture. You can see Dr. Kim's work for more details of the lyrics from the perspective of Han, but I simply want to point to one repeated line as I close this portion of the lecture, and that is from Hongdae, a neighborhood in Seoul, to Bed-Stuy, a neighborhood in Brooklyn. We're born from the same pain, shed alike tears. From the same pain, crying the same tears. The beauty of Han is that it can feel our Christian calling to mourn with those who mourn. Let me now transition to the idea of Nunchi. Communication across cultures can be broadly bifurcated as high context and low context. You and I in this room are more comfortable with low context communication, which emphasizes the actual words that are being spoken. We instruct our kids, our children, say what you mean and mean what you say. We counsel couples in therapy, don't try to mind read. It can go very bad. Well, South Korea is certainly not a say what you mean and mean what you say culture. Paul asserts that high context communication is one in which nonverbal cues have just as important of a meaning, if not more. At times, what is verbally stated can be opposite to what the person actually means. Now, often, communication contains many nuances that are much more than what emerges out of the mouth. Nunchi, then, is a communication skill or a stance that is highly valued and simultaneously stressful. It's a source of stress in the high-context communication society that is Korea. Jeong, in her book titled Power of Nunchi, The Korean Secret to Happiness and Success, describes Nunchi as the ability to evaluate a social situation, decode what is needed, and act quickly. It is a critical interpersonal skill that can contribute to one's success in personal and professional life. Nunchi 없다, or lacking nunchi, or nunchi 빵점, or having zero nunchi, are stigmatizing labels that can actually result in social alienation. Conversely, abundant nunchi is characterized by phrases like nunchi 빠르다, which is having fast nunchi, or 100% score on nunchi. These are offered as praise in the Korean setting. Note the unmistakable academic language that implies that nunchi is a quantifiable performance in Korean culture. Zero nunchi, 100% nunchi, and so on. If you're curious about the word itself, it's a compound word made up of two different words. Nun is the Korean word for eye. Poet and psychiatrist Jeong writes that she, the second part of nunchi, is likely referring to the now outdated measurement unit of length in Korea, around 3.03 centimeters. So literally, to measure with one's eyes. But in a complicated way, it's not just the ability to use one's eyes to read the room, which it refers to, but also, it might also be that it's the ability to read the eye of the other person that the word is capturing. Again, reading the eye of the other person. Jeong, the poet and the psychiatrist that I mentioned, points out that coincidentally, about 3 centimeters might be the length of a typical adult eye. And so think about scanning the eye from one side to the other to get a full picture, a quick picture of what the other person is thinking and feeling. So the eye is an important part of Nunchi. Fascinatingly, this role of the eye for social interactions is further supported by research on emoticons. If you don't know what they are, it's when you and I type, icons like that to depict different feelings. Cross-cultural differences exist in how people convey emotions through emoticons. Think about the last emoticon that you used today as you came into this room. If you were in a good mood, you might have typed something like this. If you were feeling down, maybe something like this. And if you were surprised by something, then something like that. Notice that all the emoticons that I showed you so far rely on one body part, and that's the mouth. In a culture like ours that emphasizes explicit communication, what comes out of the mouth, this makes a lot of sense. But what do you make of these emoticons to depict happiness, sadness, and surprise? Do you notice the different body part that's emphasized here? It's not the mouth, but it's the eyes. Research indicates that there are cross-cultural differences between, for instance, East Asian countries and Western contexts like ours in terms of which body part might be emphasized in emoticons. Let me give you a couple of more social, some real-life situations that Nunchi can manifest in. So I have 3 quick examples. When I was a visiting professor at a university in Korea, the faculty in the department went out for dinner. We walked over to an open table, and I sat down in one of the chairs, ready to eat. I soon noticed that all my colleagues had not yet sat down, and instead they were all standing around, looking uncomfortably at each other, and I felt very awkward. It was then I realized my social blunder, my lack of nunchi. I should have waited, like my colleagues were waiting, until the oldest member of the department sat down. Based on that, everyone else gets situated around the table. As she heads to the store, the mother-in-law asks her mother-in-law whether she wants dessert. The mother-in-law replies, "It's okay, don't give me anything." But is it truly okay, or is the mother-in-law just saying that? To act decisively, the mother-in-law not only has to decipher the nonverbals from the mother-in-law, but she must know the mother-in-law and her preferences and be able to act quickly based on this knowledge. Here's my friend Cedric Stout, who has a unique perspective on Nunchi as someone who worked in a Korean company as a Korean American.
Another good example is when your boss or your CEO, team leader, anyone that's in a position that's higher than you, when they are staying a little bit past the time that you're supposed to get off, when you have Nunchi, you don't want to be the first person out the door. You want to make sure that you're leaving the office after your boss or after your CEO. I've had many times where I've had to stay a lot later than my actual working hours, even though I'm done with all of my tasks. And, there were times where I'm like, you know what, let me just ask maybe a coworker or ask my boss, is there anything that I can do to help? And so this is just something that happens all the time in Korean office culture.
Do you notice a common theme across the 3 examples? In all 3 scenarios, the burden of having nunchi and acting upon it is on those with less power in the relationship, and not the other way around. To help you understand this important idea related to nunchi, let me briefly introduce the idea of power distance. Power distance refers to, and I'm quoting from Popsy, the extent to which the members of the society accept that power in institutions and organizations is distributed unequally. And according to an online tool from the Cultural Factor group, Korea tends to score high, at least higher relative to the US when it comes to its emphasis on power distance. It's worth repeating. In a culture like Korea where power distance is highly emphasized, the burden of Nunchi as an interpersonal skill falls on the person with less power. It's not the most senior colleague quickly deciphering where everyone should sit. It's not the mother-in-law who is trying to figure out what kind of a dessert her daughter-in-law enjoys. And it's not the boss stressed about the right time to leave work. It can be stressful for those with less power to demonstrate constant nunchi, but that might be precisely what cultural expectations call for. There is a popular Korean phrase that says, one is eating nunchi rice, nunchi 밥 먹는다, which is functionally equivalent to our saying, walking on eggshells when in the presence of those who hold more power. Many theories exist as to where this saying came from, but here's one compelling theory relevant to my argument, and that is, there's a theory that says that the phrase eating nunchi rice might have originated from this practice of those with more resources, as in wealthier, extending a generous hand to those with less resources. For instance, by giving them a meal, or giving them a bowl of rice. And the person who is on the receiving end of this favor might not feel totally comfortable eating this food that's been provided to them by this family, and therefore eating nunchi rice in the presence of this more powerful individuals in this setting. You can readily see how something like nunchi can contribute to a toxic environment, whether it's at work or at home. The solution, or one solution, to the disproportionate burden on the less privileged or powerful to have nunchi is to flip the power dynamics. That is, whenever you or I are in a position of power or privilege, to lay aside our social location to intentionally pay extra attention to those with less power. Again, such a stance is different from what is more likely whenever nunchi is involved in the Korean context, which is all about how those of lower status can serve those in higher positions. I think about Jesus, the Son of God, who during his time on earth demonstrated radical nunchi to people around him. He didn't need to. If there's anyone in this world who can legitimately expect others to serve him, to pay attention to him, to be constantly on the lookout for Jesus' need and act decisively to meet those needs, it's Jesus. But instead, Jesus turned the power dynamics on its head in how he related to people, especially those who were sick, suffering, and marginalized. Right before Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, the Bible says that Jesus wept because he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Surely Jesus in his sovereignty must have known that he was going to raise Lazarus. But his accurate nunchi allowed him to observe and feel the emotions of others around him and led him to be emotionally moved. And he cries with those who are crying. In Matthew 14:14, right before the feeding of the crowd, the 5,000, when Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Again in Matthew 9:36, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Notice that in all these passages, nunchi is twofold. Affective movement, as in feeling compassion, being moved in spirit, and then decisively taking action that was needed by, for instance, healing of the sick. How does one increase their nunchi, at least the kind that fosters radical empathy and an attitude of servanthood, including toward those who are in lower social locations? How do we create space in our lives so that nunchi can be activated, that we recognize the areas of concern and take quick action? I posit two related ideas based on the concept of time. First, to grow in our Nunchi, we need time with one another. Korean children never take a class on Nunchi. It's not something that can be manualized. Instead, Nunchi grows when you spend time together. Remember the example of the mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law? The daughter-in-law only knows which sweets her mother-in-law prefers if she knows her mother-in-law, if she intentionally spends time with the mother-in-law. Second, to allow Nunchi to do its thing, for it to be effective in moments of split-second decisions, and we also need time set aside in our schedule, time set aside. Social psychologists John Darby and Daniel Batson, in a classic study, published an experiment in which Princeton seminary students were research participants. All of them were told that as a part of the study, they would be giving a brief recorded talk. Some of the participants were instructed to reflect on what it's like to be a seminary student. So tell a story about what it's like to be in your vocation. The other participants were told, reflect on the Good Samaritan story. Reflect on the lessons of the Good Samaritan story. So the first independent variable in this experiment was the cue to think about something, whether it's why are you in seminary or the lessons of this well-known Good Samaritan story. The second independent variable was what the participants were told in terms of how much they had time to get to the location of the talk, which apparently required a bit of walking. And the first group was told, oh, by the way, you're late, so please hurry to that location where you'll be giving the talk. And the second group was told, you have enough time. You have enough time, plenty of time to get to that location. After they received the instructions, the participants walked over to the location of their talk. On the way over, they encountered a person on the ground, clearly in distress, asking for help. The outcome variable then was whether or not the research participant would help this person in need, and also which independent variable made a difference when it came to the likelihood of these students helping this person. By the way, this person was part of the research team. Psychologists are very good at lying to their participants. Strikingly, what they thought about, what they were reflecting on as they were walking over, didn't make much of a difference. Even thinking about the Good Samaritan story, think about, okay, you're reflecting on this, you see this person on the ground, not much difference, but you know what they did? The instructions they received regarding whether to hurry up or you have plenty of time to get to your location. Time matters. Specifically, setting aside time to maximize the chances of Nunchi being activated for the benefit of others so that you and I can notice people in need and act upon it matters. How are you? How are we setting up our schedules so that we can allow Nunchi to strike when necessary? How are we setting up our communal schedules? The third and last construct is Jeong. In Korea, some interpersonal relationships are referred to as being like gumdachi, which literally translates to chewing gum stuck together. Which refers to the tightness of the relationship captured under the construct of Jeong. Jeong describes a sense of sticky love between individuals. Jeong is a complicated mix of feelings of fondness, and this is a quote from Jeong and Cho, caring, bonding, and attachment that develop within interpersonal relationships. Jeong is the most radical type of platonic love between individuals. A relationship that is, I think, like the friendship between Jonathan and David described in 1 Samuel, where Jonathan became one in spirit with David and he loved him as himself. Well, I think the ESV version captures the idea of Jeong even more strongly. The soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. As a quick aside, you will have noticed when you came in, I don't have my snack with me, but there's a choco pie placed on your seats. That choco pie has become a Korean comfort snack that represents Jeong. In fact, a couple of weeks ago I was in Korea, and I'm sorry, the versions you get in the US don't have this character written on them, but the Korean versions still have the Chinese character for Jeong written in a big letter on the box. I have the box with me as well if anyone wants to come and look at it afterwards. The reason that choco pie is a symbol of Jeong is not because it's extraordinary, but because it's messy to eat. And so I suggest that maybe you don't eat it at this formal setting, but maybe take it home with you. It crumbles and it sticks to your teeth, right? But precisely the messiness is what makes it beautiful, especially when it's shared with those who you have no shame around, right? Who you share in Jeong with. South Korean parents, when they visit their son during their mandatory military service, their sort of number one choice of snack is choco pie. They take a box of choco pie, and that's like the biggest specialty that you can give to those who are in their mandatory military service. Anyway, back to Jeong. Jeong is best understood alongside the concept of what we in psychology call control of the self, as articulated by Hazel Marcus and Shinobu Kitayama in this model. Independent self-control is an understanding of the self as a distinct entity, clearly demarcated from others. Interdependent self-control is a defining of the self in relation to other people, where the identity is not clearly separated from others who make up their network. Notice how these diagrams depict the boundaries between the self and other relationships in interdependent view of self. The boundaries are much more permeable, as in dotted lines, and they're overlapping with those who make up part of your inner circle. Whereas in an independent view of self, there's a clear distinction between the self and other people. Another way to think about Jeong, then, is it's a way of relating to others, characterized by a deep affinity of other people that permits relational boundary crossing that an independent view of self would not permit. Jeong and interdependence behoove us to engage in a thoughtful evaluation of cultural practices and norms that we in the U.S. context might be inclined to label as a violation of one's autonomy. The most popular or the most commonly cited example is the practice of co-sleeping. In a study in Korea examining Korean children between 12 to 84 months, so a wide range of age, Yang and Han reported that the rate of some form of co-sleeping among parents was around 88%, so parents sleeping with their child. Okay? If the co-sleeping example is not doing it for you, I have another one, and it's the act of, I forgot to show you this statistic, 80%. It's the act of breaking bread, or in the Korean context, breaking rice. This is a fun one. Let me give you a crash course on a typical Korean meal. Each person at the table gets one bowl of rice. Also, they have their own utensils. But those are the only individual things at the table. The banchangs, or the side dishes, of which there are several, are for everyone to share. There's no such a thing as a serving spoon, as everyone is using their own utensils to help themselves to the different banchangs. There's no request to pass the blank, please, at Korean tables, because you're expected to intrude into each other's spaces by reaching across to the banchan that you like. There might even be a soup bowl in the middle that family members double dip and triple dip into, using their own utensils. Yikes, talk about a germaphobe's worst nightmare. During a study abroad trip, one of my American students, SPU student, sitting next to me, while we were having our final dinner in Korea to celebrate the conclusion of the study abroad program, and what else? We were having Korean barbecue. The student discreetly placed a piece of lettuce on my plate using her own chopsticks because she determined that I could not reach the lettuce bowl. By the way, very good Nunchi. Strange behavior, we would say, if done here in the U.S. But in Korea, it's a gesture of Jeong, and I chuckled when my American student did this. If that example is not doing it for you, here's my last one, and that is Jimjilbang, which is a public bathhouse. The bathhouses include the actual bathing area, as depicted in this picture, which is divided by biological sex. It's a common thing in the bathing section to see people scrubbing each other's body as a favor. After the bath, you get dressed in a bathhouse, provided t-shirts and shorts, and hang out with the people that came with you. There's a lobby area that includes snacks, TV, video games, heated and cold rooms with varying temperatures. Sometimes these claw machines where you can spend a lot of money and not bring many things. You also often see folks go to bathhouses with family members, but sometimes with friends, and in rare occasions with co-workers as well. I can sense some of you getting uncomfortable with the idea of bathing with your coworkers and friends. Well, some of my brave SPU students who are American students decided that they will try this out as a small group. So they went. Afterwards, the students made astute connections to Jeong, specifically the bonding aspect. They thoughtfully reflected on the paradox of being without clothes in a country that places a high emphasis on physical appearance, but because of their nakedness, they felt as though there was no judgment whatsoever. Everyone in the bathhouse was on equal footing, exposed and trusting each other with their vulnerability. This is yet perhaps another important component of Jeong, relational transparency without judgment or shame. So to close the loop on this part of the conversation about Jeong, it's emphasis on sacrificial, loyal, and emotional, and physically proximal dedication to others. And sometimes this dedication can look like boundary intrusion into the Western setting. It's a positive aspect of Jeong that nurtures interpersonal connections. So how does Jeong go sideways? Jeong can lead one to override the need for confrontations of wrongdoings. Instead of practicing Christian love that does not rejoice at wrongdoing but rejoices with the truth, Jeong can attempt to cover up the sins of another person or community in the name of loyalty and devotion. A popular Korean statement starts with Jeong 때문에, which means because of Jeong, to explain why someone might have gone along with a wrongful act or stayed too far wrong in a toxic relationship. There's a Netflix docuseries titled In the Name of God, A Holy Betrayal, which tells the story of Korean Christian cults and how and in this documentary harrowingly and graphically captures the danger of Jeong that's not paired with accountability and responsibility. These powerful cult leaders were masterful in utilizing cultural norms and corresponding practices to cover up horrific acts of abuse. Instead of pointing the finger and distancing ourselves from these atrocities, these types of documentaries and subsequent conversations present opportunities for a hard, long look at ourselves. As individuals and communities, we must not let Jeong lead us to a blind allegiance to a particular person or a cause or an institution. Eminent American psychologist Carl Rogers argued that relational warmth is a key ingredient in successful interpersonal connections, whether it's in psychotherapy or in everyday living. Rogers just had such a stunning look on life and human nature that he believed that unconditional positive regard, experienced by the therapist and shown to the client, we might say a version of Jeong, should eventually break through and help the client achieve their full potential. Christian psychologists like Stan Jones, Richard Blackman, and Jeong point out that Rogers, because of his emphasis on unconditional positive regard, turned a blind eye to unconditional positive regard sibling in a Christian worldview, namely accountability and responsibility. My second critique of Jeong is about how it typically manifests, not always, but typically. Most commonly, Jeong is selectively reserved for those who are part of the in-group. Jeong's tendency to favor the in-group is captured in the Korean saying, 팔은 안으로 굽힌다, which is saying the arm bends inward. That is, there's a clear distinction between in-group and out-group in terms of who receives our Jeong, and for that matter, our expectation regarding who will direct Jeong to us. Recall the earlier figure illustrating the difference in self-construal. Not all relationships are created equal for those who have an interdependent view of self. Some relationships, most notably perhaps mother and child, are going to share much more Jeong compared to those relationships that are more distal. Social identity theory asserts that this is true across different identities, that we evaluate and relate to our in-group members much more favorably compared to our out-group ones. This is what contributes to things like ethnocentrism and stereotyping. So how might we apply Jeong to the flourishing of God's image bearers? The intense loyalty and devotion contained in Jeong is consistent with Jesus' directive to love your neighbor as yourself, and the belief that the most cherished type of love is the laying down of one's life. But as I already outlined, psychological science suggests that we naturally reserve Jeong for those who are part of our overlapping relational circles, for those who share in our group identities. In contrast to our natural tendencies, the Bible tells us that our love of others must extend to beyond those who are easy to love, that we should strive to extend a sticky Jeong to others that do not look like us, value the same things as us, act like us. As it says in Luke 6, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? But Romans 5:8 describes a God who contracts the human tendency to save our affection for only those who are easy to love. That God did not wait until we're sinless and therefore more like Him to embrace us. Instead, while we were still sinners, if I may frame it this way, members of an out-group from God's perspective, God loved us with the greatest love possible. We have a God who does not reserve His Jeong to relationships in which that Jeong is fully reciprocated. Both psychological and biblical understanding of human nature leads me to the same conclusion. It's easy to extend Jeong to those who are like us. But as Christians being transformed to reflect the character of God, we must also find ways to counter our natural instincts and demonstrate Jeong, the positive aspects of it, to all our neighbors. I have a couple of suggestions, but for how to increase Jeong in our community and also individually. But to do so, it requires me to rely on a couple more linguistic examples. So please bear with my linguistic examples. When Koreans talk about Jeong, the phrase 정들다 is often used. I would say most often used. You now know the word Jeong. That means to permeate or to seep through. This language of permeability reflects the fact that Jeong is a passive process. Jeong just happens when you're with people that you love. But the seeping through language of Jeong also implies that Jeong takes time. Jeong at first sight is not a thing. Instead, Jeong naturally but surely takes over. The garden balsam was an old-fashioned way of coloring fingernails in Korea. The flower petals are ground and tightly wrapped around the fingers or toes. After 1 or 2 days, the color shows up on the nails. The best way to describe how the fingernails come to be a shade of red or orange is to use the language of seeping through. When the flower does its job and colors the nails well, one might say in Korean, 물 잘 들여졌다, which means the color seeped through well. Notably, this same language of permeability is not used when one utilizes a more modern form of coloring one's nails. The lesson of the garden balsam brings us back to an earlier lesson from Nunchi. For Jeong to operate in its full passivity and permeability, it requires intentional time and contact. The young child who prematurely takes off the wrap will be disappointed because the color will not have seeped through well. A couple who, by virtue of living together for many decades, have Jeong that seep through. The boss and employee, on some days, who get on each other's nerves, but over time, Jeong comes through. The student was frustrated for much of the quarter because the professor can't seem to get their act straight. But at the end of the quarter, there was a pang of sadness to wrap up the term and to say goodbye to your professor. We can say Jeong has seeped through. Korean society is intentionally set up to spend time in groups. Korean children spend most of their waking day, I'm not exaggerating, in school and after-school programs. The after-school programs are called Hagwon or cram schools. And so I've seen one estimate that says that between 12 to 15 hours of the day is spent in school. In these school settings, the same group of students share a single classroom, including for recess, including for snack breaks, including for lunchtime. In these highly contained settings, Jeong permeates. Obviously, I'm not advocating for longer school hours in our context. But the lesson of Jeong demonstrated through the Golden Ball Sound encourages us to think about how we have set up our own community to be intentionally be with each other. Briefly, there's a second way that Koreans talk about Jeong. It's a contrasting way, and it's Jeong Junda, which Junda means to give. So this is a depiction of Jeong's transference as an intentional act of giving. This is a part of Jeong that's unnatural, as I've talked about already. We would rather have Jeong seep through than to purposefully be giving it to someone. But it's precisely something that a reimagined understanding of Jeong calls us to as individuals and as a community. The idea that we can give Jeong or extend Jeong to other people. Today I tried to make the case that Han, Nunchi, and Jeong have lessons for all of us sitting in this room, thousands of miles away from Korea. I want to briefly return to Carl Rogers and his theory on what makes interpersonal relationships successful. Carl Rogers argued that there are three interpersonal conditions that need to be present for meaningful relationship to occur. These were his big three, if you will. Genuineness, unconditional positive regard for the other person, and radical empathy. As I shared with you today, Rogers' big three have connecting points with positive aspects of Han, Nunchi, and Jeong. Han has the potential to increase our genuineness or vulnerability in relationships, especially when we share the burden of Han through collective lament and creative projects. Nunchi can increase empathy, especially when it leads to relinquishing of the privilege associated with our social locations, and instead directing extra attention to the needs of those with fewer resources. And Jeong allows us to demonstrate the life-giving warmth and respect for other human beings, people made to reflect the image of God, especially when we can direct our Jeong toward those who are not like us. I want to close with this picture. To give you some context behind this picture, there was a tragic accident in 2014 in which ferry Sewol literally sunk, with passengers in it. This tragedy claimed over 300 passengers' lives, most of the deaths being high school students who were on a joyous field trip. Investigations that followed revealed that many, if not all, deaths could have been prevented had the various adults involved simply done their job. Talk about a country's Han. For the parents who lost their precious child so senselessly and so abruptly, this event is a forever Han. The pain seared onto their hearts. So back to this picture. On the right side is a mother grieving the loss of her child at a public demonstration, a gathering to demand accountability from those responsible. Her Han is in full display, agonizing and angry tears flowing down. And who can blame her? But do you also notice the other person? She's a police officer, law enforcement. She represents the other side in the situation, the government. She, from her perspective, this grieving person is an out-group member, and she could easily choose to treat a mother in that manner, detached, professional, and ignoring the emotions of this other person. In fact, one might even argue that as a police officer, it is necessary that she detaches, so that she can carry on doing her job, which is enforcing the law and not letting the emotions sway her. But here she is demonstrating the empathic, action-oriented Nunchi that we discussed today. She deciphers in the moment that what is called for is not a stoic posture. Instead, she makes a deliberate decision to intrude into the stranger's emotional and physical space, taking the action of wiping the tears from the mother's eyes. Again, radical Nunchi to recognize the need and decisively intervene, allowing Jeong to be intentionally extended to an outgroup member. Through it all, she is participating in the work of our God who will wipe away every tear from our eyes. Thank you. There's a Q&A, but before we get there, I just want to say a few things. So I'd like to thank, I'm grateful to Carolyn Moore and the Faculty Life Office for hosting this lecture, and the Faculty Development Committee members who endured my lengthy proposal last year as a part of the selection process. Thank you to Les Steele and my dean, my current dean, Katie Tangenberg, for introducing me today. And then my former dean, Dr. Michael Rowe, who in his gentle and persistent ways always encouraged me to consider this as an outlet for my scholarship. My department colleagues in undergrad psychology are always so supportive, and especially grateful to my colleague Brittany Tossin, who was willing to provide helpful input about the Jerusalem to Jericho study that I highlighted. I'm thankful to the folks who recorded their audios and videos, David Tizier, Cedric Stout, Kaylee Roda, and Leslie Chu, and giving me permission to use them. I am grateful to my research students, my sister, my father, who provided helpful feedback on many earlier versions of this presentation. I'm also grateful for my talented and eager illustrators, also known as my children, who are so gifted at turning my half-baked ideas into reality. And lastly, my wife, Sarah, who allowed me to sort of overtake our evening strolls with ideas for this lecture. So thank you for being such a willing listener to these ideas. All right, I'm done. Open it up to some questions.
My wife just returned from Korea yesterday, so
Okay.
Korea is an incredibly homogenous country. So, and we have been, I'm Korean, a marginalized one. There have been, so there is this Han of, we're bullied by Japan, we're bullied by, so I think that there's a lot of crossover culturally within Asia, but this is perhaps distinct, right? So when we do say this is for everybody, right? Is it, right? Is there some conditions? I hear you make that connection to African Americans, right? But yeah, is this for everybody? Is there some processing? That is for those who haven't been marginalized, right? And in a much more diverse setting. That's my question.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. And I would say that there are people that would argue and very hold tightly to the idea that Han should be only described as a Korea construct, a Korea-specific construct. And I think certainly I understand that even the word Han is something that's very unique and doesn't have a English equivalent, right? Hence, I try to describe it to you using different examples. And so in that sense, there are unique aspects of Han in Korea, but I do think that Han does translate to other marginalized experiences. And I think for those perhaps who are unable to relate to the marginalization experiences of, for instance, colonization or a war that, breaks apart your family, right? I think it also offers a way to try to increase in your solidarity toward the pain of others, right? By, here's an artwork that I can really appreciate and see the Han that's expressed there. So there is an opportunity, even for those who may not necessarily feel that pain associated with those structural oppression, to still be able to connect to the idea of Han, right? I think it's something to be not claimed lightly, right, the idea of Han, because it's based on collective angst and collective trauma that's deeply rooted.
Thank you for that really educational lecture. That was for someone who's not Korean. When you're talking about Han, there was the phrase, the cure is in the pain. And my sense of, I'm not a psychologist, but my sense of popular psychology or popular understandings in the United States is that negative emotions, we identify negative emotions as like anger and pain, and that the goal of life is to not experience those, to get over them, to get past them, that grief is not something to be held, but to be resolved. And so how would this understanding, how would it help in counseling practice, or how could it change how we actually work on people who feel these emotions, in some ways maybe feeling them in ways that might be destructive, but the goal might not be to completely make that go away.
Right. So I think it challenges the assumption that the goal of psychotherapy is symptom reduction or symptom elimination, and instead to be able to sit with the pain, right, and to lament, but also simultaneously be that lament process, be healing, right? And so I think the Wednesday protest is an excellent example of that, where much of it is an expression of pain, expression of anger. There's literally a lot of yelling that happens at those demonstrations, but also it's peaceful. It's something that, like you look around and you see not only the harmonies, the grandmothers there, but also young children there. And even young children can articulate why they're gathered there, right, in a way that is simultaneously healing, right? And so I think I was trying to make the point that the pain is painful, but we don't necessarily have to get rid of that pain, but instead, through the expression of it, through lament, experience a different kind of healing. And I think that does challenge some of the traditional understanding of Western forms of psychotherapy.
Pardon me. I just finished an undergraduate cross-cultural psychology course with Dr. Kim, and I was thinking about the material of the lecture, and I couldn't help but think about how so much of this research was possible because of the cross-cultural psychology context. And I guess a question that came up for me is, what have you learned from being a facilitator for that of so many students who you've taken to South Korea? What's something that you've learned from taking SPU students and facilitating these cross-cultural experiences?
Wow. It's an amazing question, Eva. Thank you for asking that. Let me think about it for a few moments. I've always reflected on what my students have learned, but what have I learned? I've learned that SPU students are amazing, and they are just super curious, super resilient. I told them it'll be very uncomfortable for you to go to a public bathhouse. And they said, we want to go. But Dr. Kim, please don't come with us. Right? Is what they said. I said, gladly. So I've learned that they're very adventurous, resilient, and super respectful to cross-cultural differences, but also not shying away from making those mistakes that are part of the cross-cultural experience, right? So, for instance, like these respectful SBU students, because of norms around physical distance, would kind of maintain an arm's length away when getting into a subway, right? And we would always have to tell them, it's actually working against you to try to keep a distance when you get into a subway. We might actually have you miss the subway because the door will close on you. So you got to stay right up against the person in front of you. And that's how you contribute to the community, right? Not by trying to maintain your distance, right? And so, yeah, being willing to make those mistakes and to reflect on that. Yeah, I think those are some of the sort of the positive things that really, like every time I go to Korea, afterwards I think, that was nice, but it's really tiring also to go on these trips because I'm away from family for an entire month. So maybe this might be the last time I do it. And then I think about the positive aspect, right? And I think, okay, got to do it one more time, right? So actually I have a wonderful group of students that are going this September. So really looking forward to that. Eva, does that answer your question? Okay, thank you.
Paul, thank you so much. I wanted to touch on Jeong, if I'm pronouncing that right? Yeah, Jeong. And this idea of this kind of sticky connection, which is very moving and very challenging. And I'm thinking about last year's Surgeon General's report on loneliness and anxiety, right? It hit everybody, you know, and that the trend lines that were happening were not just COVID, right? Everybody thought, but it was actually 2003. It was seeing all of these distancing. And so I'm hearing on one side that you've identified, you know, as a psychologist, you know, the high need for connection, the high need for intimacy, what's there, but we also continue to drift apart. What are some ways that you're seeing, at least in your, particularly in counseling research and also cross-cultural research, that we can begin to really see that we need to start finding ways to make those connections again? What are some things you're observing, at least? And I think cross-culturally, this is why I'm really moved by this, is that particularly in kind of, you know, white-dominant, you know, American culture, we have so much to learn by the voices and diversity that can bring to help us alleviate some of this isolation and loneliness. I'm just really curious about, you know, what are some ways that we can get there, I think, as you're seeing it.
Thank you, Jeff. And yeah, I recently wrote an essay or short piece about this that hopefully will be coming out soon, but I thought about the mentality that has to shift, right? The idea that we have to have clear boundaries. Boundaries is something that we talk a lot about in the mental health profession, at least in the Western context, where it's all about setting boundaries, self-care, all really good things, but I think sacrificial love requires that sometimes boundary intrusions are necessary, and finding ways to do that, whether it's, I don't know, like when I go to Korea with my students, I sometimes have to help my students operate the laundry machine, which I never thought I would do as a professor, right? But it's not only a humbling experience, but also a reminder that through these boundary intrusions, right, you have Jeong that grows, right? And there's no shortcuts, right? But these sacrificial sort of letting go of my own comfort a little bit, right? So that there's boundary intrusions that can take place for the benefit of all of us. So I think that's one answer that comes to mind. And then, of course, an obvious thing, I think since the pandemic has been just being in person, right? I think finding ways to be in person, and I get that sometimes that's not possible, right, for various reasons happening in our world, but to the degree possible, finding time to gather and being in community, I think is something that's super helpful in countering that social isolation. Yeah.
Thank you for that wonderful lecture, sir. That was really amazing. I have a question about Han, but before I ask, I wanted to know if eating Nunchi rice is ever used in English, or is it strictly a Korean, among, Korean?
It's a Korean phrase.
Okay.
So Nunchi pop. So I translated that into English, but yeah. As far as
if you hear it in the hallways, you'll know where that came from.
Yes.
So my question about Han is, does it adjust or modify? What happens in the case of the demonstration where the parents were grieving over the loss of the children?
Yeah.
What happens to Han when a government commission comes out and all these people are held fully accountable and that's all adjudicated? Or what happens when the government of Japan or the emperor finally does a proper formal apology? Or what happens? Are there, is there a role for forgiveness, and what does that do for Han? And then what happens when it's like taking revenge? Is that like going overboard? Does that besmirch Han? Is there is Han like a noble thing? Anyway, that's a few thoughts. And thanks.
Thank you, Rod, for those thoughts. One area of Han, or another application of Han that I didn't have time to get into is this idea of revenge. Some Korean movies are really famous as a revenge film, meaning like graphic violence that depicts powerful revenge, right? So like a family that's wronged by a wealthier family, and the son now goes out and takes revenge, right? And the idea there is Han is the driving force behind that, right? And obviously, from a Christian perspective, we think about how that can be reimagined so that on one hand, the pain is recognized, but on the other hand, that type of violence is something that is not positive, right? In terms of resolving Han, I do think that there is a place where eventually, for instance, like that mother and the pain that she's experiencing, in some ways, that's a forever Han, right? That to lose a child. On the other hand, certain aspects of that Han can be resolved if the government takes specific steps that are satisfactory for the families, for the victims, right? But I think what ends up happening, and this is not unique to the Korean context, but it's the people in positions of power that try to determine when Han is resolved, and not the people or the families that are impacted by Han, right? And so I would say, yes, it's possible to resolve Han, but it should be up to those who have experienced the trauma to be able to say Han has been resolved in some way. I think that would be my response. Yeah.
One more question. Hi, thank you, Dr. Kim. Hi. One of the questions I had with each of these, you talked about it a little bit in your presentation, but how they build off each other, especially the last example is how they all worked together in this one image. Is there any sense of how these build off one another or grow within each other, like experiencing a collective trauma leading to one of the others?
Yeah. I'm trying to think about when you say build, Dr. Hoff, I'm thinking about like building a statistical regression model, right, that kind of thing. I think they do like feed off of each other, as I try to give one example. Like for instance, like people who are traumatized, they want to hang out with each other as a way to build that community, and through that, Jeong builds up, and then Nunchi is used as a way to take care of one another, right? And so I do think that they kind of feed off of each other, but I'm not sure if one is like cause and the other outcome, right? It's kind of everything coming together, right? Does that make sense? Yeah.
Okay, I guess we really have one more question because Sarah has a question. Sarah?
I didn't plant the question.
Thank you, Dr. Paul, for that lecture. I was wondering, because I didn't grow up in Korea, I was born in Los Angeles. Like, is Han something that maybe Koreans don't expect from like Korean Americans? You know, like, is there like a, you know, you're Korean by descent, but because you grew up in Korea, like you don't know, or like, does that make sense? Like, can it be passed? Because like it passes from generation, but does it kind of stop for the Korean Americans?
Yeah, I think with acculturation, certain values, behaviors, they start to fade, right? But I think when you think about how bicultural acculturation might take place, there's a sense where hopefully what I believe to be really important values and postures are passed down from one generation to another. And what's interesting is some Korean scholars in Korea, are really wanting to move away from talking about something like Han. They're saying, oh, it's a thing of the past. Let's not dwell on the past. It was a very different kind of a country back then when we talked about Han, but we shouldn't talk about it anymore. But then Korean American scholars who are exploring their identities as Koreans are starting to write a lot more about this across disciplines, right? And so there's this interesting phenomenon of Korean scholars saying, don't write about it, and then Korean Americans wanting to explore this more. So, yeah. We can talk more later.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. Your lecture has hit all the points for what I consider to be a great lecture. It has taught me something. It has inspired me to learn more, and it's caused me to reflect on myself and how I can be transformed in thinking about how I can serve others, and I really appreciated the Christian aspect that you brought into it. So thank you. Let's thank him again. As you know, the Winifred E. Weeder Award is one of the highest awards given to a faculty member at Seattle Pacific University. This award was established to highlight, celebrate, and uphold the values of the liberal arts in a Christian education. Your lecture has certainly accomplished that goal. Thank you. In honor of you and the work you've done to remind us of the importance of the liberal arts in our curriculum, I want to present you with this Weeder Lecture medallion. This medallion, though small, recognizes your commitment to excellence in research and in the liberal arts. And each year you are encouraged to wear this medallion as part of your regalia so that all may be reminded of the importance of the liberal arts curriculum. In fact, I was petitioned earlier that we should wear these more often, that all the Weeder lecturers should wear them more often, but at least with your regalia. So I just want to present this to you, and then I will put it on you here. And if people want pictures, now's the time. There are drinks and refreshments out in the back, and our speaker will be here. And this is a time for us to just kind of mingle and talk for a little bit and have community. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. It is done. Thank you so much.
I wish that I knew Nunchi better.
Me too. It's such an important skill. Yeah. I always go longer than I practice, so I think the time was okay. I went like 1 hour.
It's 8:32, we want to be over at 8:30.
Okay.
We started 2 minutes late.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
exactly.
Okay.
That's great.
Thank you for all your work.
It was my pleasure.